next we have more about Flutter. So to discuss about full stack development with Flutter and Dart, I'll welcome Luke Moody. Okay, he's a Flutter and Dart Google developer expert and Flutter lead and consultant. He's the founder of Cleer Consulting and a Flutter technical lead. He specializes in crafting robust mobile applications with Flutter, .NET, and GCP. Please welcome Luke.
That's okay. Thank you. Does this have a laser pointer? Oh, it does. Beautiful. Cool. So, hey everyone, welcome to Google I/O Extended Sydney 2024. I'm very excited to be giving this talk to you today about full stack Flutter. It's more full stack Dart, but full stack Flutter just kind of rolls off the tongue a bit better, to be honest. So you've just been clickbaited into coming to this talk, really. Bit of level setting before we do anything. Who here, just by raise of hands, has actually heard of Flutter before? I mean, you probably just heard about it now, so I imagine majority of people. Who here is a Flutter developer or has developed an app before? Like 2 people, this is gonna be great. And who here has actually built a backend? I'm gonna guess absolutely no one in Dart. Oh, actually 1 person. Oh, a couple of people. Oh, you know what? I stand corrected. So there's quite a few things I want to go through today. Sort of 3 main points in the middle there, but we'll go through who am I, some backend as a service options, what is full stack Flutter. We'll go into Serverpod, which is actually the framework and package that we'll be looking at to create a backend in Dart today. Getting started with Serverpod, some of the concepts. There is a lot of concepts to go through, and I don't have time to go through everything. Otherwise, we'll be here at like 9 p.m. So I've handpicked a couple of features I want to talk through at a very high level. And then we've got some FAQs, and then I'll field sort of some of your questions at the end as well. And yeah, let's just jump straight into it, I suppose. So who am I? I'm not the first person that was just mentioned there. My name is Luke Moody. I'm a GDE. We've kind of just went through this, so I can probably just skip this slide. But the QR code there is just for a LinkedIn page of Cleer Consulting, so check it out if you want. I will share these slides on my GitHub, and any GitHub repo code that you see today will be on there as well. So if you want to go through there in your own time, you're welcome to. And yeah, let's just jump straight into it. Some backend as a service options. What is out there? If you're a Flutter developer, the first thing you'll think of is Firebase. And this is kind of the first stop for many Flutter developers when they first start off, because it really gels and works with Flutter really well. And it's really easy to work with. And then you've got Supabase, which is often compared to as an alternative to Firebase. It's open source, and it does aim to sort of mimic a lot of the functions and capabilities that Firebase offers. So it is a good option as well if you don't use Firebase. And then we do have AWS Amplify, which, in my opinion, if you don't have an existing AWS infrastructure, I'd probably recommend using Firebase or Supabase. But if you do have some sort of infrastructure already inside of AWS, then probably best to integrate and use this, which is pretty cool. But some of the main drawbacks with these options is different programming languages. So if you're used to Dart and maybe you're only a Dart or Flutter developer, you're not really going to be an expert in JavaScript or TypeScript. So then context switching and sort of trying to learn that as well can be a bit tricky. And then you do end up going down the Cloud Functions route in Firebase, for example, when you're wanting to add some custom code or integration that is not actually provided out of the box with these services. And last but not least, code reuse on both front end and back end. This is not really a huge point or a huge drawback because it's kind of standard anyway, but it is cool to be able to reuse the same model in both front end and back end. So, bit of a drawback. So what is full stack Flutter or Dart, I suppose? Here's a quick timeline. I won't really tell you everything about it, but about 10 years ago, there was a package called Dart Shelf, which was kind of the starting point for Dart backend for development, which is pretty cool. And very recently, a lot of people and companies have started supporting full stack Flutter, or at least want to make it a bit better than what it was 10 years ago. So yeah, recently, Dart, how do I do this laser pointer? Oh, you can't even see it on white, that's great. So Serverpod 2.0 was released this year, and that's actually what inspired me to do this talk, sort of along with Fullstack Flutter Conference that happened about a month ago, which is really cool. I would recommend registering and having a look at those videos, because it's quite cool quite some cool concepts that's happening there as well. But let's just jump into Serverpod. What exactly is it? So it is pretty much just a framework or a package that allows you to build a backend in Dart and deploy it anywhere, just like you would any other API or web server. So it's pretty cool. That's it on dart.dev or pub.dev? Yeah, pub.dev. So it's got your logging, it's got built-in caching out of the box, and it's got object relational mappers as well. So you can actually write queries in Dart, so something you're familiar with, and use Dart types to query with null safety and all that kind of stuff, which is nice. You don't actually have to touch SQL or anything like that, which is cool. Some of the features, you've got file uploads, authentication, data streaming, task scheduling, health checks, and easy deployment, all sort of stuff that you'd be pretty familiar with backend and API development. So we'll cover a couple of those topics. Let's actually just get started. There's a few prerequisites, obviously. You need an IDE, obviously. You'll need Flutter and Docker. Those are the main three things you need. That's it. And then you can also install a VS Code extension called Serverpod, which will help us down the line, but it's just for writing YAML models. So you actually don't really need it unless you want IntelliSense. So seeing as there's only 2 people or maybe a few people that actually use Flutter or have used Flutter, this essentially activates the Serverpod CLI on our terminal so we can run Serverpod commands. And you can create 2 different types of projects. There's a mini project and there's a normal project. Mini is the most bare bones thing you'll ever get. There's no caching for you. There's no database that's already there for you. Whereas with normal, or is it even called normal? Just the normal Serverpod create, you'll get everything. So the logging, you'll get the caching, the database, everything out of the box, which is cool. So use a mini if you want like a really, really nothing API. So I hope you can, oh, there we go, I can probably use my laser now. Yeah, that's cool. So you'll get 3 packages. You'll get the server package, which is what we're going to be diving into most today, which is going to hold all of our schemas, our endpoints, our models, everything we need to run a backend will be there. We have the Flutter package, which is actually your Flutter app. If you already have an existing application, you won't need that, but it sort of generates one for you in case you don't have one. And then you have the client, which is actually pretty much just an automatically generated package. You don't actually have to touch anything in there. It's all generated for you. So let's go into the Serverpod, or our server folder even. Excuse me. So in the main.dart file, this will look pretty familiar to those of you who have actually built an API before. We're initializing Serverpod, the protocols we have, the endpoints we have, that are actually imported from our packages. This is all out the box. I actually haven't done anything yet. This is just all given to you. And you're also given web server routes as well, which is like a web application you're able to add to your web server as well. And then we start. So that's all the main.dart entry point is. And just to spin up the server, we cd inside of the demopod server. We compose, build our Docker container and image. Again, this is all sort of generated for you, so you don't have to do anything besides run these commands. And then we actually run the main.dart file, which is the entry point we just looked at there. So then if we look into Docker, we'll see our demopod server is running 2 out of 2. This is because we have the normal demopod project, serverpod project, because it's running a server and a database. So it's running. Now what can we do? Well, if we just use an API platform, say Postman, for example, we can see here, oh, you can see my laser in white, localhost, which is our web server, and then we have /example, which is our example endpoint that's given to us, and we're calling the method hello. Actually, I can do this and it will highlight it. That is a very slow animation. Is that even happening? Nope. Oh, there we go. So on this screen, it doesn't actually show. So we've got example/hello, which is the method inside of our endpoint, and it has a query parameter of name. What we can say is, let's just give a value Tiana. We can say send, and it'll say hello Tiana. So that's our web server up and running. We don't have to do much in about 5 minutes, and that's all generated for us, which is cool. And this is sort of the Flutter app that's actually generated from that Serverpod create that I showed you. So it's already hooked up to the server as well, which is pretty cool. But if you have an existing application, you would probably just copy the connection code that's given to you in this Flutter application. So that's pretty cool. So let's actually start creating some endpoints, or what does an endpoint actually look like? So inside of the Serverpod folder, we have a lib source endpoints. Now, every endpoint you create should be under the endpoints folder, because when we're generating all of our endpoints, then it actually checks for this folder. This is the folder it looks for to generate endpoints. So we have an example endpoint that's already generated for us. And if we go inside, this is all it is. It's a very, very simple class called example endpoint, and it extends endpoint. Endpoint is given to us by the, obviously, Serverpod import, and it gives us everything we need to sort of build. It's all in sort of back there. We don't actually have to do anything. And it has a method called hello, and it's probably good to know that this is an asynchronous operation, obviously, as APIs should be. So that's this future right here. So it returns a future of string, which is the hello name. And there's two parameters. One is session, which every endpoint has to have a session, because it gives us access to the information about the call. Like, is it a GET request, POST request? Is the user authenticated? It also gives us access to the DB context and any files. And then we also have the name parameter, which we've just seen as a query parameter. And then returns hello name, which is fairly straightforward. Now, what's generated on the front end side is this client here, and it generates, it knows that we have an example endpoint, and it also knows that we have an hello method that takes in a string. So that's all generated for us. We don't actually have to, add a body or anything like that. We just pass it through on the hello method that's generated for us, which is pretty nice. But let's actually look into serializing data. It makes it very easy to pass models between the server and the client. So in a real world, you wouldn't just be passing strings, you'd be passing models and different data. So just like the endpoints, it'll be under the models folder, and we actually create the models by having a YAML file. So we define it in a YAML file, which will sort of look like this. Obviously, this will be two separate files, but we have a very simple class employee. Has 3 fields, has name, date of birth, role. You can have nullable fields in there if you want. You can have strings, integers, booleans, whatever you want. And then we also have company, which has also fields, name, founded date, and it also has a list of employees. So you can even reference other classes that you've created as lists as well, which is pretty cool. And then here's the generation command I've been talking about the whole time. You just say serverpod generate. It will then generate the client code. It'll generate your model code to be used, whether in the front end or back end, which is pretty cool. It's good. It takes about 2.5 seconds, which is pretty quick. Now, if we go back to our hello method we had before, we can actually now use this employee parameter here. We said, OK, now we need an employee parameter, and we will return back the name of that employee. And it would look something like this. We give the employee JSON body with a name and a role. And you'll notice I didn't specify date of birth because it's nullable. So it doesn't actually need that, which is pretty cool. All right, so now let's just jump to working with a database. It does get a bit more complex here, but it's still fairly straightforward. We now have 2 different classes. We have a user and an address. We'll start by saying that now there's another field here called table. And this is where we're now telling our server, hey, look, we now have 2 new tables. We have a user table and an address table, and it will map that to an SQL database. And address just has one single field called street, and the user technically has 2 fields here. One of the field is address, but we've mentioned that it's a relation, which means it's just an object relation field. So it's related to, obviously, oh, I'm pointing at the wrong place, this address here. So what we need to let the generator know is that it has a unique index called address ID, which will map to the address's unique ID or primary key in the database. This will make more sense probably as we go along, but then what we do is we create a migration, which if you're familiar with databases, you have to create a migration to update the database. So it does all that for you, then you just apply it and you can move on. And this is where it's actually kind of good for people that aren't familiar with SQL or just starting in the back end. This is generated for you, so it gives you a good sort of visualization of, oh, okay, this is how you actually create a table in SQL or whatever you really want to use it for. So create a table address user for us out of the box. It also creates that unique index and the constraint and the foreign key and references, etc., all out the box. We don't have to do that because we've already defined it in the YAML file, which is good. And then what we're able to do is let's pretend we have an address endpoint and we want to insert an address field now. All we do is we say, OK, let's send in a required address body JSON, and then we insert it into the DB using that session parameter I mentioned before. We can just say session.db insert address into the address table. And it's going to return us that address as well. And let's say we had a user endpoint as well. Now we can insert a user, which would be like user, I don't know, ID. It'll generate a random ID for us, obviously. But we can say, so if I just go back a second. So I create this street. It's got street, my street, and it's assigned an ID of 6. I then save a user with the address ID of 6. It's then going to be related to that address we've just created. So we insert it like so. And a cool thing, what we're able to do is when we're trying to get a user now, we're able to define, hey, what exactly do we want to include in the request or in the body back? So because it's related to the address, we're able to say, OK, I want the user, and I also want to include the address that that user is linked to. So all we need to do is pass ID 6, and it actually gives us the address ID and then the actual mapped address to that address ID, which is address ID 1, and then my street is my street. So I added a link here for relations. This is just for a one-to-one relation, but you can have many-to-many, and you can go crazy with that if you really wanted to. It supports a lot of CRUD operations as well, like finding companies or finding a model in your database where tname equals whatever. All Dart types as well, which is cool. You can also update. I won't go through all of this, but you can update the names. You can update all the names where, and then update all of the companies. And there's many, many more filters, relational queries, sorting, transactions, pagination, and so on and so forth. So if you want to learn more, there's the link. So next thing is authentication. We probably want authentication if we're handling maybe sensitive data in the database. And authentication is pretty easy. It is recommended to use the Serverpod auth server package. Reason being is you can actually create your own authentication if you wanted to, but it's probably best just to use this because it already handles email authentication, Apple authentication, Google, and you can also link it to your Firebase project authentication as well, which is pretty cool. So all we do is we import this server, pretty much server.dart file, and it gives us the authentication handler out the box, which is nice. So this is in our main.dart file, the entry point. And we can also set a lot of config options. There's over 25 different config options, like min password length, if the user's able to add a profile picture, if they're able to change their profile picture, and so on. And back to that session object again, it now gives us the auth state. So is the current user signed in? No, yes, maybe. Do we have the authenticated user ID so we could fetch the user from the user table, that kind of stuff. But a really cool way of just requiring authentication for an endpoint is by overriding the require login variable that's actually given to us by the endpoint. So if we say true, you try to give a request to this without being authenticated, you're going to get an unauthorized response. And you can take it a bit further by having scopes. So let's say you add an admin endpoint, and you do require the admin scope. Then you can add that there. And the top bit is actually how you give a user a scope, just by the user ID. But then you can also add custom scopes. Let's say your app is actually pretty complex. It has a lot of scopes. Then you can actually create your own, which may not be fully there already. And you use them just as you would any other scope. And the final thing I'll sort of talk about with authentication is you can actually hook into sending authentication emails or password reset emails, and you can use whatever SMTP package you want to send email, SendGrid, Twilio, whatever you want to use, which is pretty cool. I keep saying pretty cool. I can't stop saying that. Should we have a cool counter? How many times I've said that? Anyway, uploading files. So it does support handling files out of the box. It already has a storage and database for that to begin with. But as you're scaling out, you'd probably want to migrate to GCP storage or Amazon storage or S3, which we'll look into. So this is fairly straightforward. Again, we're using that session parameter to get the storage. We're creating an upload description, and then also, you can verify your upload. And in the front end, it would look something like this. If you're uploading a file, we're able to check if it's a success, upload the file, all that kind of stuff, which is nice. And yeah, I'm not going to go through every single thing, but come on, next. You can check if the file exists, get the public URL, you can get the byte data, all that kind of stuff out of the box, which is nice. And this is where you can add Google Cloud Storage. So all you have to do is actually import the specific package and then say, oh, here's my cloud storage settings or server, whatever. You give it storage ID, bucket, all that kind of stuff. Same with Amazon S3. So all you have to do is add this, and none of the underlying infrastructure that we've just looked at there changes. It's all pretty abstract, so now it will point to the S3 cloud storage or the Google Cloud Storage. Next up is scheduling. This is I actually really like this feature. So there is a concept called future calls, so something that's going to happen in the future. And you're able to, again, you pass the session object, and you also pass an object. It could be any model entity you'd like. So you create this like you would create any other class. You do extend, sorry, I should probably say, you do extend future call, and you pass the model that we're passing. And, wow, why did I add animations? Next. Okay, then we just register the future call using the server in the main.dart file. So we register it. You'll see we add a string, example future call. I'd probably recommend having this in some sort of abstract static class, because if you have a lowercase f here and in another file you have an uppercase f, it's just going to be one of those things that it's tricky to debug. So recommend having that in a constants file. And then what you're able to do is, let's say a user logs in, and an hour later we want to say thanks for logging in or signing up, whatever. We can say, all right, this future call, I want to pass it the data, maybe it's the email, whatever it is, and it's going to happen in 1 hour. And you're also able to do a future call at a specific time. So you say, okay, example future call, here's the data, and I want it to be on New Year's saying Happy New Year, right? But then you may want to actually cancel this future. Maybe the user unsubscribes, they don't want to listen to you anymore. So you can give an identifying string, and then you're actually able to use the session object, maybe when they unsubscribe, to cancel that future call so it doesn't happen. And last but not least, deployment. There's 2 ways you can sort of, or there are different options for hosting Serverpod. There's serverless, which is pretty minimal. It's easier configuration, easier to maintain, or very minimal maintenance, to be honest. But a lot of the time, you would go for a server cluster because it has all the features that are supported, and it scales up pretty nice as well. And I won't go through the full deployment, but here's a very quick way on how you can deploy it. You initialize your Google Cloud project, or maybe it's already initialized. You set the config with your project ID, so you'd obviously have to authenticate with your Google Cloud account and whatnot to your CLI, but then you can set the project ID, and then all you need to do is in the production.yaml file, which again is already there for you, it's generated, you just update a few values, where's your SQL database, what's the port, what's the name, and so on and so forth. You can update the passwords in the password.yaml file, again, generated for you, you don't actually create this. And then, long story short, you just have to run this shell script command that's actually given to you, so then you don't have to do anything. It's then shipped off to Google Cloud, which is really cool. All right, so some frequently asked questions. Is Serverpod production ready? Yes, but I'd probably use it for projects that are less complex and do not require complex integrations or API logic, because it's not really at that scale. It's more maybe for a side project or a project that really doesn't need heavy computation or doesn't need to scale too much. But it's definitely production ready. You can run a server, a production server. Can you unit test? That's something I didn't go over, but it's very important. You can. It doesn't have its own sort of package or testing framework yet, like Flutter Test does. But there are ways around this. If you abstract your logic into an interface or some class, then you can test that, by itself. But testing the endpoints and stuff like that, I think the owner has a way around it, but it's not fully supported yet. But you can do it if you abstract. Should you give it a try? There's 2 yeses there, but yes, if you're a Dart developer, like I said at the beginning, if you're stepping out into the back-end world and you've got no real knowledge of it, it's good to sort of get accustomed to how a back-end sort of should work, the endpoints, protocols, data mapping, how you're working with an SQL database, passing data. It's really good. And that's pretty much it. Is there any questions? Do we have a mic to give Susie? You can just shout and let everyone hear you.
Thank you for your presentation. It's really good. I just have 2 questions.
Yep.
One is that the authentication package, does it support Auth0?
Ooh. The auth package that's given to us by Serverpod, I don't think so. It just supports email, Google, Apple, and then Firebase. But you can create your own authentication handler. It would just be a bit more work. But you can support Auth0.
Too much work. I'm lazy.
Fair enough.
Okay, so my next question is that the file server storage.
Yep.
You mentioned that it can host up to 100 files. Is the limit based on the number of files or based on the storage size?
Did I say it can be 100?
Yes.
Did
I remember that.
I don't remember saying it could start up to 100. There is a inbuilt Serverpod file storage, which maybe I said that supports 100, but if you're integrating with Google Cloud Storage or Amazon S3, then the limit is what you've set on that configuration for that platform.
Yeah, got it. Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? Yes. So the question was, can it run on a native VM, or does it need a Docker container? That's a good question. I'll find out and let you know, but my understanding is that, yes, you'll run it in a Docker container, and maybe you have that Docker container inside a VM, maybe, but I don't think it can run just without that container. But I'll check and I can let you know properly. Any other questions, or all good? Okay, sweet. All right. Thank you.